So the way I usually coach is I do it in a bit more of a structured way, right? So every session there's a worksheet like this, and we don't always have to go through every single question, right? The questions are there to illustrate certain concepts, right? So once you understand the concept, we can just skip ahead. Yeah. So let's start off with this first one over here, right? On the river, right? You have one guy, player A, who is playing close to GTO, but obviously it's not possible for a human to play exactly GTO, right? So let's say he's maybe trying to play GTO, but it's just over bluffing by a tiny little bit, right? Like half a combo or something. Right? And then you have player B, who's just a calling station, right? He's calling all of his bluff catches. So who would you say is exploiting who in this scenario?
I would say that the player that's making more money feels like a trick question, but feels like A.
Okay, so there's different levels of looking at this, right? On like the surface level, if you don't consider like blocker effects and card removal, player B is actually exploiting player A, right? Because at the end of the day, if you think about what the GTO strategy does, right? It's designed to put your opponent in a tough spot with his bluff catches, right? The idea is just that, if you're bluffing too much, your opponent has a really easy call. If you're bluffing too little, he has a really easy fold, right? So if you play GTO and you have the correct value to bluff ratio, his bluff catches will be break even, right? Zero EV. But because, player A, he's over bluffing, even if it's just by a tiny little bit, right? Player B's bluff catches will have some EV. And, he's actually, the funny thing is, it might be like a calling station or whatever, right? But he's actually unintentionally maximizing this EV by calling all of his bluff catches, right? So this illustrates two things, right? First of all, you do not have to be conscious about it in order to exploit your opponent, right? When you see two fish play against each other all the time, right? They're exploiting each other non-stop. And that's just the way poker is, right? It's a pretty random game. And then the second point, and I would say the more important point, is that poker is not about who plays closer to GTO, right? This is why it's never a good idea to just play exactly GTO in practice, right? Poker is about which direction you're deviating in, right? So if your opponent is deviating on the side of like calling too much, then you just want to go in the opposite direction, right? In fact, you want to go as far as possible, even if it's over bluffing by a little bit, right? You just want to call all of your bluff catches, right? So that's the first level of looking at it, right? And then if you consider like removal effects, then it becomes a little bit more complicated, right? And I would say
not all bluff catchers are created equal.
Yeah, exactly, right? Some bluff catchers are actually pretty minus EV, right? So the way that it works in like most situations, right, is that the GTO strategy with a certain value bluff ratio, right, it doesn't make every single bluff catcher in player B's range break even, because like you said, they have different removal effects, right? So most situations, I would say, kind of depending on your bet size and all that, right? We try to make the bluff catches, for example, with neutral effects, right? We make those bluff catches break even, right? And then once you do that, automatically, player B's bluff catches, those with good removal, maybe they block some calls, they unblock folds, right? Those will automatically become plus EV. And then those with negative removal will just become minus EV, right? So in this case, even though, player B is deviating on the like correct side, right? Player A is over bluffing, so of course you want to call all of your bluff catches. But because player A is not bluffing by that much, right? A lot of player B's bluff catches will still be like incredibly minus EV to call, right? I'm not sure if you saw like this hand where Barry Sweet made this crazy call with Jack 10 high.
Yeah, no, I didn't see it.
So the hand was just like I think it was a single raise pot, right? So queen high flop, and Barry. So it's a button versus small blind versus big blind, right? It's up, and then Barry Sweet was in the big blind, and he just check called down with Jack 10 high on a queen high board. I think it was like queen 7 for 3 deuce or something. Yeah, and he won against like some 8 high hand.
Wow.
Yeah, so it's like the reason why I brought it up is because Jack 10 in this situation, right, in heads up, it is actually a pure bluff catcher because the button is never supposed to be bluffing with king high, right? So with Jack 10, you beat all of your opponent's bluffs, right? And you obviously lose to his value as well. So you would expect that if you don't take into account blockers, right? Jack 10 should be a 0 EV call, right? But because of all these blocker effects and because ranges get so tight by the river, here Jack 10 is losing like 20 something big blinds as a call, right? So these blocker effects can get huge on the river. Okay, so I'm going to skip ahead to this question over here. All right, so we raise with king queen from the low jack, big blind calls, flop is ace jack 3 with 2 spades. So you have a gut shot and backdoor flush draw, right? So you decide to see bet, big blind calls, and now the turn is a 9 of spades, right? So would you say that this hand is good to barrel with?
Yeah, I mean, in general, I like to think about these spots where, obviously depending on stack depths, but if we're relatively deep, when I'm deciding to bet flops, oftentimes it's how often am I going to be able to bet the turn? And there's a lot of cards on the turn that will allow me to keep barreling. Those are cards that I will bet flop, and then I'll continue on turns for cards that.
Yeah, I think that's good logic. You want to build the pot with these kinds of hands. Right?
I want to be able to go 3 streets in case I do make a 10, or do make a flush.
Okay, so let's take a look at what the solver does. Now, what we see is that there's very, very little betting going on, right? So I assume you're kind of familiar with solvers, right? At least the interface. So look at what King Queen is doing, right? Even with King Queen with the King of Spades, right? It's barely betting at all. And of course, the reason why it's checking so much is because our range is checking a lot, right? This turn is terrible for us, right? Maybe it's not obvious why it's terrible, right? But the point I'm trying to make here, right? And I'm sure you're familiar with this as well, right? Is that before you think about your hand, you got to think about your range, right? And especially in lines where you have the initiative and you're barreling down, right? The most important thing is always whether the run out is good or bad for you, right? And so there's 2 things we need to get into here, right? First of all, why this turn is so bad for us, right? And also why we need to play so passively when the turn is bad, and what exactly does a bad turn mean, right? So first of all, the reason why this turn is bad is because we've raised from early position, right? So the ranges tend to be very asymmetrical. If you look at the low jacks range, right, we don't really have a ton of low suited cards, right? We're not raising, 6-4 suited from the low jack, right? So most of our flush draws and flushes, it's all like suited broadways, right? Ace-X suited. And for the big blind, it's just the opposite, right? He has a ton of low suited hands, and then most of the suited broadways, he's 3-betting. So when you get this kind of texture, right, where all 3 of the spades are pretty high, it has the effect of just blocking almost all of the low jacks flushes, right? So we have like a severe disadvantage in terms of like a severe nut disadvantage, quite a big equity disadvantage as well. So the big blind, you can see he has all of these flushes that are not blocked by the board, right? So by right, he should be doing quite a bit of donking here, right? The only reason why he's not doing that is because I didn't allow him the option to donk, right? I mean, if you have a big advantage, you should just be playing aggressively, right? And of course, if he's checking entire range, then we just cannot afford to do that much betting. Right. So
is this are the inputs that he's checking entire range?
So you can actually tweak it here, right? You can see I left this blank. There's this box that says donk sizes. Yeah. So of course in practice it's probably a bit more realistic to not allow the donk, right? I don't think a lot of regulars implement this as a part of their game, right? So if you think someone is checking their entire range, then it just means you need to be playing very passively against him, right? It's kind of like fighting a war. If you have a bigger army, you actually have the responsibility to make the first move, right? Whereas if you have a smaller army, like over here, right? Our army is so small, right? We don't have a nut advantage. We don't have equity advantage, right? It's just suicide to try to attack our opponent, right? What we should do is just check our entire range, right? Because it's his job to make the first move. He has the bigger army. If he wants to make something happen, he needs to attack us. Right, so we check everything. We wait for him to attack us, and we kind of set a trap. Right, if we're out of position, we can check raise, or here even if we're in position, right, we can check and expect him to be very aggressive on the river. Right after we check the turn back. Yeah, so that's the idea, right, behind why King Queen is not betting that often. It's really because our range is not betting that often, right? In fact, even the times that we do have a flush, right, you'll see that we do a lot of checking with flushes. And I think this is quite intuitive as well, right? If you have some kind of strong hand, yes, of course, what you want to do is get value, right? But in these kinds of situations where you're at such a big disadvantage, right? You can kind of expect your opponent to be very aggressive when you check, right? So, it makes checking like a relatively better option compared to betting. Yeah. And the way the equilibrium works is that if you don't want to check too many flushes either, because if you do that, then your checking range will be too strong, right? And then your opponent will stop putting so much pressure on you. So, visually, it looks something like this. Right, in any given situation, let's say this is your range, right? You're gonna have like some strong hands, like flushes, right? And you're gonna have some weak hands as well, right? Maybe marginal hands or bluffs. Right? And I'm gonna draw this line over here that represents our betting frequency, right? So this is just like any kind of situation in general. Doesn't matter if it's a flop or the turn on the river, right? Usually we're gonna have more weak hands than strong hands. Right, and this represents the betting frequency, right? So this would be 0%, and this would be 100%. Yeah. So for simplicity, right, let's assume that we need to have a ratio of 1 strong hand to 1 weak hand the times that we bet, right? It's not always going to be true in practice, but just to make things simple, right? So we can do this, and we can do this or this or this, and our betting range will still be balanced actually, right? Because we have like 1 strong hand to 1 weak hand, right? But notice as you shift this to the right, right, look at what happens to the checking range, right? At this point, the checking range is almost 100% weak hands, right? So when you look at this solution, right, you have to understand what the solver is doing. Is trying to manipulate the proportion of strong hands in its checking range, right? So you don't want to do this because your opponent is always going to be betting when you check, right? Your checking range is 100% weak hands. Right? And then once that happens, your strong hands will start to prefer checking, right? At the same time, you also don't want to do this because your checking range is too strong, right? And if your checking range is strong, your opponent will not bet a lot when you check. And then your strong hands will just have higher EV as a bet now. Yeah, so it's basically finding the equilibrium, like the indifference point where, so here your betting range is balanced, right? But your checking range has the exact proportion of strong hands, right, that makes your opponent, right, bet just the right frequency when you check, right, such that your strong hands are indifferent to betting or checking, right? And then this is the equilibrium point that we get, right? Whereas there are bots where, bots that are very good for us as well, where we have like more strong hands and not that many weak hands, or maybe about the same amount of weak hands, right? So this would be maybe a situation where you three bet from the small blind and the flop is ace high, right? Really good flop for you, right? And in this case, where do you think the line should be?
In terms of like doing checking versus betting?
Yeah. So
we would be doing more betting, right?
Yeah. So like here.
Yeah.
Yeah. Notice that even when you do this, your checking range is still pretty strong. Right? At least compared to the first example.
Yeah.
Now you have like way too many strong hands in your checking range because it's not the absolute number of combos that matters, right? It's all about the proportion. Right? And you cannot really be having like 1 strong hand to 1 weak hand in your checking range, because if you did that, your checking range would be so strong that your opponent would never be playing that aggressively when you check, right? And that would just make you want to bet the remainder of your strong hands. So this line should actually be here. So this is the reason, right, why we just bet our entire range on boards that are very good for us, right? Because we can do so without compromising our checking range, right? We can bet all of our value and remain balanced without like sacrificing anything in terms of our checks. Yeah. And then, conversely, there's also boards that are really bad for us, right? Like we have tiny amount of strong hands and most of our range is like, weekends, bluff catchers or air, right? Then in this case, right, what we should do is just check our entire range, because, even at this point, right, our checking range is so weak that our opponent is going to apply a ton of pressure when we check, right? And this is already going to make the EV of checking out strong hands higher than the EV of betting, right? So this is pretty much what you see over here, right? It's important to understand that this is what's going on behind the scenes, right? This 7.16% is not just like some random frequency, right? And once you like understand what's really going on, then you'll naturally know like what to focus on also when you're looking at solvers, right? Because the main mistake that people make is they tend to focus on the little details, right? Like if you look at what our flushes are doing, for example, people tend to be very drawn to the fact that we're betting like king 6, king 7 all the time, right? And then like king queen, king 10 is checking quite a lot, right? And yeah, I would say that is kind of important, right? But okay, first of all, why do you think this is happening?
Yeah, so by blocking like the 7, 8, 6 of spades, their hand is slightly more weighted towards like having ace-x, second pairs and gutters, things like that.
I would say if you have like king 7 or king 6 of spades, right, you actually weight their range a bit more towards like flushes that will raise you, because it's raising most of the queen high and the 10 high flushes, right? So you don't really want to have like queen 10 of spades, for example, right? That hand, when you bet, you're not really going to raise that much, right? The times that you do get raised is probably against like a king high flush. So instead, if you have a hand like king 7 of spades, right, then you unblock this entire region, right, of queen x and 10x of spades that will raise you, and then you can just pile all the money in, right? You can probably stack them by the time you get to the river. That's why this is quite a common trend as well. If you look at a lot of these turns where the flush completes, right, we always prefer to bet the flushes with a big gap, right? Like ace deuce of spades, right, is gonna get bet like a lot when the flush completes, because we just unblock like every single flush in between. So we've gone into like quite a bit of detail about that, but in fact, this is the exact thing that you should not be paying too much attention to. Okay. Right? Because if we have, let's say if I have two different strategies here, right? Strategy 1. And this is something that a lot of people try to do, right? They try to sort of simplify their decision, right? Because again, we can't like copy exactly what the solver does, right? We have to make it easier to execute somehow, right? So some people, what they do is they bet like king 7, or like king 8 to king 5, 100%, and then they check like king queen, king 10, 100%, right? Which seems reasonable, right? Because we've just talked about the reason why we might, why we would prefer betting king 7, king 6 to a hand like king queen, right? So this doesn't look like a bad strategy, right? And if we compare this to strategy 2, right? So this one is my strategy. It's probably what I would do here, right? What I would do is, let's say if you open up Range Explorer, right, and if you click on this hand class of flushes, right, you'll see that it's betting 36% of the time, right? Yeah. So my strategy would be to bet every single flush according to what the hand class of flushes is doing, right? So bet every single flush 36% of the time. Yeah. So which strategy do you think is more exploitable?
Well, the one that's more exploitable is strategy 1, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's exactly correct.
The one that's harder to execute is strategy 2.
I would actually argue otherwise, right? It's maybe it's impossible to do it if you don't have an RNG, right? But
yeah, if you're not randomizing, I mean, I don't know in my brain how I'm going to randomize 36%.
Yeah, I guess it's a bit difficult if you're playing live games, right? Like probably the best way would be to look at your watch or something. And I'm not asking you to do that, by the way.
Yeah,
I'm just showing you what it means to be exploitable. Right? Being exploitable is whether or not you find all these details, right? It doesn't really matter if you've gotten the overall frequency wrong, because this is what affects the composition of your betting range as well as your checking range, right? So if we do this, for example, we bet like king 8 to king 5 all the time, we check king queen to king 10 all the time, we're probably not going to be close to 36%, because there's way more king queen and king 10 than the lower kickers, right? There's a much higher weight of the suited broadways, right? So if you do this, probably you'll end up with overall frequency of maybe 20% or like 15%, something like that. Seems about right? Since there's so much more king queen and king 10, and if you check those hands all the time, you're not going to be betting 36%, right? So once that happens, right, it's going to mess up the proportion of hands in your betting as well as your checking range, right? And you can see this very clearly in Range Explorer, right? This shows you the breakdown of your entire range, right? And then you can also see like what happens when you bet, right? When the times that you bet, like this is the composition of your betting range. And in fact, this is what you're trying to achieve with all of this mixing, right? You're trying to make sure that you have 17.8% flushes in your betting range, right? And 15% sets and so on, right? But the problem is that now, instead of betting your flushes 36%, right? You're betting about 15%. So there's not going to be 18% of flushes in your betting range, right? It's going to be something like 9% or less, right? And at the same time, your checking range, right? It's supposed to have 2.4% flushes, right? Now it's going to have more because you're not betting your flushes often enough, right? So this is what makes you exploitable, right? You're supposed to have an optimum proportion of different hands in your betting and your checking range. Right now, there's too many flushes in your checking range and too little flushes in your betting range, right? And notice that this is not necessarily a bad thing. It could be good if your opponent was folding a lot versus your bet, right? Folding a lot, not check raising a lot, then now it's good, right? To have like a bigger proportion of bluffs and weak hands in your betting range, right? And it becomes even better if your opponent, right? Let's say he tends to be quite aggressive on the river after you check behind, right? Then now it's great, right? Instead of having 2.4% flushes, you might have like 5% if you do this. Yeah. So again, mistakes, they don't always cost you, right? Sometimes they cost you, sometimes they don't. Right. In this case, I guess it would be really bad if your opponent had the opposite strategy, right? Maybe he is really aggressive when you bet, right? And quite passive when you check. Then now it's just a complete disaster, right? Because you've messed up like your betting and checking range in a way that heavily favors your opponent. Yeah. So, after going through all this, I hope you can see that understanding all this GTO stuff, it doesn't mean that we want to play according to it, right? I think it'll be quite silly to just bet every single flush 36% of the time, right? Because even though that's what we want to do in theory, right? In practice, our opponent is always going to have some leaks, and we need to use our understanding of GTO, right, to think about the leaks that he can have, and then from there we decide, like, how often do we want to bet flushes, right? Do we want to have more flushes than we should in our betting range? Do we want to have more flushes than we should in our checking range? Right. So that's just a few tidbits about solver usage, right? If in future you want to like do your own study and stuff, right? At least you have some idea of what to focus on and what not to focus on, right? Don't get too distracted by the details, right? It's really what the overall hand class is doing that's important. Yeah, exactly. Frequencies are way more important than all these little details.